There's a town tucked so deep in the hills that even the roads seem unsure if they're supposed to lead there. The signs warp with time. The maps never quite agree. Some say the town was built on a fault line, others that it was a refuge during the plague, but none of that matters, because the only thing anyone ever remembers about the place is what happens to its people. No one lives past 42. It doesn't matter how healthy you are. Doesn't matter what kind of life you've lived. When your 42nd birthday comes, you go to sleep that night and you don't wake up. No violence, no sign of struggle, just a stillness. A quiet that settles over your home like dust. And by morning, your family knows before they even check. They always know. Some tried to leave, of course, believing the curse, or whatever it was, only applied within town lines. But it didn't matter. Whether they moved across the state or across the world, their time still came. 42, without fail, as if the town wasn't just a place, but a clock you couldn't stop hearing once it had begun to tick. People don't question it anymore, the way you don't question why the sun rises. They mourn in advance. They marry young. They say goodbye quietly, with more grace than fear, because they've grown up knowing it's coming. Everyone has a plan for their final year, and no one expects more than that, except for one, the Clockmaker's grandchild. He lived in the tallest house on the northern ridge, a sloped roof mansion that looked like it had been stitched together from pieces of other homes. No one really knew how old the house was. Its walls sagged like it was tired of holding secrets, and its windows never showed the same thing twice. But what people remembered most was the sound. It was never silent. Inside that home lived more than 200 clocks, all ticking at different speeds, chiming at impossible hours, none of them synchronized, and none of them ever breaking. The old man, the clockmaker, he was known for strange inventions. Not just watches and gears and grandfather clocks, but odd contraptions that tracked the tides or claimed to measure dreams. He never sold his work, never explained it, just nodded to those who asked and went back to his ticking world. When he died, right on time at 42, the town wasn't surprised, but they were surprised by who he left behind. A boy, small, pale, and unsettlingly quiet. His grandson. The boy didn't speak for the first 6 years of his life, not a single word. Doctors couldn't find anything wrong. Some believed it was trauma, others said he was just slow to develop. But those closest to the family whispered something else, that the boy had been taught silence, the way others were taught speech, because when he finally spoke, something changed. The story goes that it happened during a storm, the sky thick with thunder. The clocks in the house had stopped, every single one, all at once, and the boy, still small, still expressionless, walked into the center of the house, placed his hand on the grandfather clock, and said just 3 words. No one remembers what the words were, but every clock started ticking again. Not long after that, things around town began to shift, subtly at first, people losing track of time more often. A school bell ringing too soon, children claiming entire afternoons had vanished, and always someone would ask, was he nearby? Meaning the boy, because they all felt it, somehow, that he wasn't bound by the same rules. That time bent around him differently, and that maybe, just maybe, he knew why no one ever lived past 42. I never believed any of it, to be honest. Not until my brother's 42nd birthday. That was the day I realized the town's curse wasn't a myth. It was a mechanism, something built, and someone, somewhere, was still winding it. In our town, turning 42 wasn't a celebration. It was a countdown. The weeks leading up to it were heavy. People moved slower, laughed less. They started giving away their belongings, not out of fear, but ritual, as if there was dignity in preparing for the end. Some would write letters they knew no one would read. Others would disappear into the woods and never return. But most just waited. When my brother turned 42, the air in our house changed. He wasn't sick, he wasn't sad, but something about him seemed dimmed, like he was already pulling away from the world in quiet ways, skipping meals, forgetting small things, smiling at nothing. Our mother tried to keep things light. She made his favorite dinner, lit candles, set out a cake. But we all knew what this birthday meant. No one ever lived to see the morning after it. That night, I stayed awake. I couldn't sleep, not because I was afraid he'd be gone, but because I didn't know what gone looked like. Would I hear him leave? Would I find him cold in bed? Would he vanish into air like some fairy tale curse? There were no stories about what actually happened, only that it always did. So when I heard footsteps on the porch around 2 a.m., I assumed it was him, that maybe he wanted one last walk under the stars. But when I looked through the front window, I saw someone else, the clockmaker's grandson. He was taller now, older than I remembered, but still too young to explain the weight he carried in his movements. He stood there, silent, looking at the door like it had asked him a question. Then, without knocking, he stepped back and whispered something into the air. I didn't catch it. I wish I had. Because in that moment, every clock in the house, even the digital ones, jumped forward by exactly 1 hour. The second hand on my wristwatch spun in a blur. My phone reset itself, and upstairs, my brother gasped awake like someone had pulled him out of deep water. He lived. Morning came, and for the first time in this town's entire history, someone turned 42 and didn't die. People were confused, some angry, others terrified. Whispers spread faster than the wind, theories, accusations, prayers. Some said my brother had cheated death. Others said it wasn't death at all, that it was time itself, and someone had broken its rhythm. And all of them pointed in one direction. Back to the boy who no longer lived in that creaking clock house, but who seemed to appear exactly when the rules were supposed to apply, and undo them with nothing more than a whisper. I tried to confront him the next day, but he was gone. No one had seen him leave. No one knew where he went. And that silence was louder than anything he could have said, because deep down, we all understood something had shifted. The town had followed the same rule for generations. 42, no exception. Until him. He hadn't saved my brother. He hadn't even touched him. He had just spoken, and whatever he said made time hesitate, just long enough to change everything. After what happened with my brother, the town began to shift. Not openly, not in the way cities change after disasters or revolutions. This was subtler. People still opened shops, nodded on sidewalks, fed their chickens, swept their porches, but their eyes stayed on the edges of things, the tree line, the sky, the ticking hands on their walls. Because deep down, we all knew something had been disturbed, a rule broken, and we were waiting to see the price. I started digging, not out of curiosity, not really. It was obsession, the kind that makes your sleep thin and your appetite disappear. I found myself staring at the old newspaper records, the archives of deaths, every obituary ending at 42, dozens, then hundreds. No variation, the same dates of birth, the same patterns, a perfect rhythm, until now. I knew I wouldn't find anything public about the boy, so I went looking for the old man instead, the original clockmaker. His home still stood, though no one had lived there in years. I broke in during a thunderstorm. I don't remember why. Maybe I thought the storm would drown out the sound of me disturbing something sacred. The house was full of clocks, still ticking, still offbeat, but somehow alive. I found his workshop behind a hidden door in the floor, just a trapdoor under a rug, like in a fairy tale. Inside there were notebooks, dozens, pages yellowed, ink faded, but still legible. Not mechanical notes, but writings, theories. Not about time as we understand it, but time as something conscious. Something that could feel when it was being obeyed or disobeyed. One passage stopped me cold. Time cannot be rewound, only folded. If you speak between the seconds, if your voice finds the silence between ticks, it listens. Another, the boy does not age the way we do. He was born during a moment I broke, not a second, a silence. He is not mine, but he is bound to what I failed to contain. That line stuck with me. He is not mine, because the town always assumed the boy was his grandson. But if that was a lie, or worse, a misunderstanding, then who was he? I heard something move above me, a slow, creaking floorboard. My body froze. The notebooks in my hands felt too loud. I closed them, returned them where I found them, and climbed out. Nothing was there, but every clock had stopped. Not broken, just ... still, as if holding its breath, waiting. I left that house and didn't return. But that night, I had a dream. The boy, older now, sat beside my bed, whispering words I couldn't hear. When I woke up, my phone said it was 2 hours later than it should have been. My hair had grown half an inch, and I remembered things that didn't happen. A scar on my arm from an accident I'd never had. A name in my contacts I didn't recognize. A photograph in my camera roll, me standing next to the boy, smiling, but I've never smiled in a photo with him. I've never been in one, not that I can remember. Until that point, the pattern had held. 42, always 42. It was the number carved into our collective understanding of fate, unspoken but absolute. But about a week after my visit to the Clockmaker's house, someone died early. She was 38. Her name was Lena Moores, ran the flower shop near the edge of town. Quiet woman, polite, wore her hair in braids, and never missed a Sunday market. She wasn't sick. She wasn't troubled. She simply didn't wake up. And when her husband found her, the clocks in their home had shattered. Not fallen, not smashed, just broken from the inside. Glass blown outward like something had escaped. Even the ones sealed behind cabinets and glass domes. Every one of them cracked at the same moment, 3:17 a.m. It should have been impossible. And yet, it wasn't the only thing wrong. There was no body, only the shape of one. The indentation on the mattress, the faint smell of her perfume, the heat of someone who had just left the room, but her clothes were folded. Her phone was still charging, her shoes by the door, everything as it should be, except her. The town didn't say it out loud, but they knew this wasn't a death. It was an extraction. Some began whispering that the boy, now a young man, had taken her, that his voice no longer just bent time, but peeled it open, that maybe he was rewriting the schedule, stealing years from some, handing them to others, choosing who got to live longer, or worse, choosing who had already run out of time, even if they didn't know it yet. But no one dared confront him, because no one knew where he was. He didn't have a home anymore. He drifted. Some saw him near the lake. Others swore he visited the graveyard each night, walking backward between the tombstones. There were even those who said they heard him muttering under his breath as they passed, and later found days missing from their week. One man lost a whole month. He remembered putting up Halloween decorations, only to wake up and find snow on the ground. I kept thinking about Lena, 38, 4 years early. Why her? And I kept thinking about the way the clocks had shattered, as if they'd tried to resist something pulling her through. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered, what if the clocks weren't just telling time? What if they were holding it in place? What if that was the clockmaker's secret all along? He wasn't measuring time. He was locking it down. And the boy, the one who had been born in the silence between seconds, was finally unlocking it, one person at a time. It occurred to me then, maybe no one had ever truly died at 42. Maybe they had simply passed through, out of sync, pulled into whatever was waiting behind that final tick of the clock. And now the rules were fraying, the structure crumbling, and the only one who could speak its language was no longer hiding. He was editing. I didn't mean to find him. I wasn't brave enough for that. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I didn't ask questions out loud, I'd be safe. That I could keep observing from a distance and never get caught in whatever unraveling he was orchestrating. But time doesn't care about your plans, and neither did he. I was walking the long way home one evening, cutting through the old orchard near the edge of town. The air was heavy, like it had been raining just moments ago, even though the sky was clear. I remember the exact moment it happened. A bird froze mid-flight. Its wings hung in the air like it had been stitched into the sky. The wind stopped. The leaves didn't move. Even my breath seemed trapped in my chest. He was standing beside one of the trees, just standing, still as a painting, watching me. He didn't look older, but he didn't look young either. His face was the kind you'd forget if you looked at it too long. Not because it was unremarkable, but because it felt like it belonged to too many different ages at once. His eyes were distant, not distracted, but focused on something far behind me, or maybe far ahead. And then he spoke. Not loud, not commanding, just a whisper, but I felt it, like it was inside my bones, vibrating through my ribs. I didn't understand the words. They weren't in any language I knew, but they struck me like truth, like something I'd always known but had forgotten how to remember. The world lurched, not violently, more like skipping, like a scratched record, catching and jumping forward. When I blinked, the orchard was full of leaves again, green, not the dead ones I'd been walking through. The sun was lower. My phone said it was 3 days later. My voicemail was full. People had been looking for me, but I had no memory of being gone. That night, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize my face. Not because I looked different, but because I looked tired in a way I didn't earn, like I'd been awake for something I shouldn't have seen. And then the dreams started. Flashes of other versions of this town, some flooded, some burning, some frozen in eternal winter. I'd see myself in them, older, younger, sometimes not myself at all, always standing near a clock, always listening to someone whispering from the silence between ticks. I started writing down what I could remember, names, phrases, symbols etched into metal. I didn't know why, but it felt like I was being taught something, or maybe reminded of a responsibility I didn't want. And then I heard it, the voice again, in a dream that felt too real. He said, "The clocks don't keep time, they keep you." Since then, nothing's been the same. Time slips when I speak too fast. Hours vanish when I stare too long at a second hand. And sometimes, I see people in town who shouldn't be here, people who died, walking with the same expression he had. I think I'm becoming like him. Or maybe I already am. And the version of me that lived before that hour, the hour he spoke to me, has already disappeared. Maybe you've felt it too. The missed moment, the time jump, the feeling that something moved and forgot to bring you with it.